about postdoctoral application and the selection process. The APPIC Postdoctoral Committee is excited to provide you with information about the selection and application process that's designed to be helpful for applicants, postdoc training directors, and internship training directors providing mentorship. My name is Aaron Joyce from the Southwest Consortium in New Mexico, VA, where I'm the internship and postdoctoral training director, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this webinar. Our discussants today are Dr. Wayne Siegel, the training director from the Minneapolis VA healthcare system and chair of the APPIC Postdoctoral Committee, and Dr. Beth McQuaid, director of the Clinical Psychology Training Consortium at Brown University and a member of the APPIC Postdoctoral Committee. So a few pieces of information about the webinar structure. For the first half of the webinar, Drs. McQuaid and Siegel will briefly address frequently asked questions we distributed in the webinar announcement email. And then for the second half of the webinar, they'll answer questions posed by you, the participants. And although your questions will not be answered until the second half of the webinar, you can use the chat box to type them in at any point that they come to mind, and I'll be tracking those questions as they arrive. Questions are going to be viewable to all attendees, so you can keep note of questions that may be popping up in the chat box that you may also want to ask. You're all muted, I believe, and so we'll just have you use the chat function as your main mechanism for communicating us what you would like to know today. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Siegel.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to first start by apologizing. I did not update our cover slide with Dr. Joyce's name on there. So I am sorry about that. We'll proceed. So the differences between internship and postdoc selection, everybody's very familiar with internship selection, but postdoc selection is different. First of all, there's no match for postdoctoral programs. The exception to that would be for clinical neuropsychology programs participating in the APPCN match. But we do have APPIC selection guidelines that are intended to help organize the selection process. But we'll talk more about the guidelines and a little bit more. For more information about kind of overall selection processes around postdoctoral training, you can go to the APPIC main webpage. One of the main menu headings on the very top is postdoc. If you just click on that, there's a wealth of information, and much of what we're going to cover today is in there in different places as well. The other thing to be aware is there is an imbalance in postdoctoral selection favoring the applicants. There are vastly more positions than applicants because of the nature of postdoctoral training and the different types of postdoctoral training programs. It's impossible to know what the total universe of programs is, but we know that every year many programs go unfilled. So you're basically in a buyer's market, which is good news for you. The other aspect is to understand that there is not a standardized application and match process for postdoctoral programs. For internship, there's a standardized process using the APPIC directory online and the APPIC match. Those rules can be frustrating for some people, but they do provide a lot of organization and control the process to an extent. For postdocs, as I mentioned, we're trying to organize the process through the selection guidelines, through APPICAS, and the Universal Psychology Postdoctoral Directory. Programs are still free to handle selection the way that they see fit. So if somebody's choosing not to follow the guidelines, we're not breaking any rules or grave ethical concerns, but we're trying to get people to voluntarily comply. As I mentioned, in neuropsychology, there is a national match system. There's a national match through the APPCN. but not all programs participate in that, which creates a variety of other problems for that system. Many of the programs that do not participate make offers earlier than that match date. And so it's really important for neuropsych applicants to really track their programs, what programs are going to be following the match, which programs are not, and when their selection and notification processes are. And that is true of all postdoctoral programs, but it's particularly true in the neuropsych realm. And I'll hand things over to Beth.
Okay, thank you. So people really wonder whether or not they need to do a postdoc. Some people have that question. And the purpose of a postdoc is really for advanced or specialized training, which is in contrast to the broad and general training that you've been getting during the internship and prior to that in graduate school. Specialized training can help. It can help you market yourself for your next position, and it can help you, postdoc can also be a way to accumulate supervised clinical hours as well. In the frequently asked questions document, there's a link to a very useful article, and we may be able to post that in the chat box too, but which gives you some pros and cons about the postdoc process and whether or not if you're considering whether or not you need to do one. In terms of career paths, there are some specialty areas in which it is expected that you will get a postdoc and have that kind of specialized training. For example, neuropsychology, health psychology, rehabilitation psychology. It is becoming more the standard in the field to have a more formal postdoc in those areas. Also, trainees who are interested in launching a research career, it's pretty typical to do a postdoc to gain focused experience writing manuscripts and understanding the grant writing and grant submission process, and to kind of develop as an independent investigator as well. And it tends to make you more competitive for academic positions. People wonder how much the postdoc sets the direction of your career path. And, it's, with the exception of some of the recognized specialties that I mentioned previously, it certainly can be useful and can be advantageous. But it's not the case that your career path is set in stone by the type of postdoc that you do. This is one of those circumstances where we're going to recommend that you seek guidance and mentorship from your supervisors, your training director about that if you have questions about whether or not a particular postdoc is aiming you in a direction that feels too narrow for you. We do get a lot of questions about whether or not you need to go to a postdoc that is an APPIC member postdoc or an APA accredited postdoc. And this is something that's very different at the postdoc level than it is at the internship level. So both APPIC accreditation and APPIC membership and APA accreditation are quality metrics. And they mean that a program has undergone a comprehensive review process and often, very rigorous. And so in that way, that there are certain quality controls in place for those specific programs. But that being said, there are many programs, it is not necessarily the standard, and there are many high quality programs that are not APA accredited or APPIC members. So, but you just need to do a little bit more homework to ensure that there's a training emphasis and that the program is of high caliber if they don't have those quality metrics in place. Additionally, research postdocs are typically not APA accredited or APPIC members. And so that's not expected that they necessarily would be. It can be, in terms of the state of your postdoc and whether or not you need to complete your postdoc, where you plan to be licensed, it makes things easier, honestly, but it's not necessary. So people do move all the time. But if one of the things that we often advise trainees is if you know that you want to live somewhere, if you have family in a particular state, that it's really important to become comfortable with the licensure requirements in that state and whether or not the postdoc experience that you're looking into is going to meet those licensure requirements. So those do still vary by state. And so that's, you have to do some homework if you know that you don't necessarily want to stay in the state that you're going to be doing a postdoc. I'm gonna, oh, you can go back for 1 second. Thanks. So, I mean, just two quick things in terms of arranging your own supervised experience versus, doing a formal postdoc. Again, it's one of those situations where if it's not a formalized training experience that's been evaluated, you need to do a lot more homework to make sure that the experience you're getting is training oriented and is going to enable you to get the hours that you want for licensure and get the training experience that you want. And last on this slide, people who are applying to research postdocs often wonder if they're going to be able to acquire clinical hours for licensure. This is a very common question. And, I will say that I don't think that you need to be, think that it's going to reflect poorly on you if you ask that question. It's very, very typical for somebody who's been in a clinical program or a counseling program who's interested, or a psychology program who's interested in being, pursuing full licensure, even if they're doing a research postdoc. So it's really okay to ask that question, and there usually are some mechanisms through which you can do that. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Okay, so, in terms of emailing prospective supervisors, for research postdocs, we, prospective mentors get those kinds of emails all the time. And it may be the case that they are, for example, waiting to hear about grant funding or just have gotten a position put together and it hasn't been posted yet. So there is no, it's very, very typical for people to do that kind of an outreach email, and it's totally fine to do that. In terms of competitiveness for research postdocs, I do think that people will look at your CV and look at whether or not you have extensive research experience. They do look at the metrics of your manuscripts and whether or not you've submitted grants. On the other hand, if you can make a case for your degree of interest in a specific research topic and describe your trajectory in a way that makes sense, I think that you may be competitive. But you are competing with people who do have potentially more established research profile. In terms of benefits, like family leave, most postdocs do have benefits, and they are through the hospital or counseling center or university in which you're hired. And it does make sense to ask questions about that so that you understand things like, sick pay, vacation, family leave, and those kinds of things. And those things can vary considerably, but you can often find that information on the website. And sometimes people do wonder about whether or not components of a postdoc are negotiable. And the answer to that is, for salary, typically not. So it's often the case that these are positions that are, if they're funded by the government, they have a salary that's set, that's non-negotiable. And for other places, there are certain metrics that are set around a postdoc salary that really make that difficult to budge. There are other things that can be negotiable. For example, if your internship runs late and the postdoc, has an earlier start date, whether or not you can change the start date, or if it's possible to do a 1-year program for something that's typically a 2-year program, those things may or may not be negotiable, and it's okay to ask. But for salary, it's less so the case that that's negotiable. Okay. Wayne, I think the next slide is for you.
Okay. So the UPPD is the Universal Psychology Postdoctoral Directory. The UPPD was developed, came out of a recommendation for the Postdoctoral Summit, which occurred in 2016. So it's a relatively new endeavor. And the goal was to have one place that applicants could use to search for postdoctoral programs. Prior to that, there was not kind of one source. There were many different sources, and it really was hard to know where to go. The APPIC directory does have APPIC member postdoctoral programs in it, but that's only a fraction of the number of postdoctoral programs out there. And there's roughly 4 times as many programs outside of the APPIC directory. And so the UPPD is the main source. It currently has over 1,200 listings. There are some postdoctoral programs that have not chosen. There's no system to ensure that every postdoctoral program in the country gets their listing up there. But by now, the vast majority of programs are aware and do list their membership in there. As Beth had indicated before, APPIC membership and APA accreditation are indices of quality of a program. There is no criteria to be listed in the UPPD. Programs can list themselves. There are some fabulous accredited and APPIC membership programs. There are some fabulous non-APPIC and APA accredited programs. But there are also some programs in there that may not be of high quality. And so buyer beware to a degree. If you're looking at a program, doing what you can to kind of assess the quality of that. The UPPD is very different than the APPIC directory online. The directory online was basically built for internship programs, and the UPPD is built for postdoctoral programs, and you can search by specialty, emphasis, or focus area very specifically. So many programs, like my program, has different specialties and focus areas, and so I have different listings for all of those. Whereas from accreditation perspective, that is, well, now it's 3 separate programs, but it could be 1 program for some. So it really allows you to kind of do some more specialized searching, which is great for programs if they can get the word out there, and great for applicants that you can find what you're interested in. It really is kind of the go-to place to look for postdoctoral programs. So I mentioned this already to an extent. Will all programs be listed in the UPPD? The answer is no. The vast majority are in there. We're working hard to get kind of programs that are not listed to use that. Another struggle that we have is every year getting programs to update their listings. And I'm willing to bet many of you have already kind of found the UPPD and started looking for programs. And you may have noticed that not all programs are updated to the current selection cycle. Programs have many demands on their time, and it's challenging for them to get those things updated. If you come across a listing that is not updated, it doesn't mean the program doesn't exist. I would reach out to the training director, the contact information in that directory, ask them about that. And as a side, you could encourage them to update their listing, and you would appreciate that as well too. Probably the largest segment of programs that may not be in the UPPD are predominantly research type programs, particularly grant funded programs that may not have recurring funding every year or may not be recruiting every year. Many of those are also listed on division listservs, so you can pay attention to that. But there are many of those also listed in the UPPD. It also the UPPD allows you to search for kind of percent of research allocation to the program too. So again, it's more specifically designed for what people might be looking for in postdocs. So how do you access the UPPD? It should be really easy to find. If you go to the main APPIC site, which is appic.org, one of the top menu items is Postdoc. If you just hover your mouse over that, one of the listings that will pop up is UPPD, and just click on that. You could also Google UPPD, and it will be the first thing that comes up in your search. So I already talked about the assurance of quality in the program. Many of the UPPD listings may link to a program's website or other materials. The more detailed or more information a program has, usually those can be marks of qualities. Again, APA accreditation, APPIC membership are kind of clear marks of quality where those programs have been reviewed in some way. If a program does not have one of those assurance of quality, getting good mentorship around asking good questions of the program through your application and interview process can help you determine what is the quality of that program and whether it will be meeting the needs that you have. There are many private practice-based programs in the UPPD. Some of these are, to be frank, just supervised hours for licensure, and you're not getting a lot of training as a result of that. But some of them are actually really good training programs. And so you as the buyer or the applicant need to kind of make those determinations. And again, using mentorship and guidance from hopefully internship training director, other people that you've used for mentorship roles in the past. So are there opportunities for international students in postdocs? The answer is yes, but that can be hard to determine. It's not a common, and it's often maybe a fluid factor whether programs will be able to accept international students. And so the best thing to do is searching the UPPD for programs that you might be interested in and inquiring specifically with that program. Some programs may be explicit in their UPPD or their website or other materials whether they are willing to accept international students or not. Another question, similar, are there clinical postdocs in the UK and Canada? And are there directories for these international programs? Not aware that there are international directories. There are a few programs in Canada that are listed in the UPPD. There could be more between the last time I looked, but you can search for that. And so, yes. Probably those as well also. I'm going to turn it back over to Beth.
Okay. So we're going to talk now about the application process. And, you know, a lot of people after traveling from grad school to internship wonder about the location of their program and whether or not they want to travel again. And some people do take the strategy of trying to find a postdoc where they want to work or settle down after that training experience. And so, you know, you can certainly limit your geographical region, and some folks have done that for internship as well. And some people do find that they are competitive for postdocs where they've done their internship. So that can also be a factor for many people. You know, in terms of dissertation, you know, we also get the question about whether or not you should have defended before you apply to postdoc. And the answer is that it isn't necessary to have done that, but you really do have to be certain that you're going to complete your dissertation and defend your dissertation prior to starting a postdoc, because, you know, most institutions will not employ you as a postdoctoral fellow until you have obtained your PhD. So, you know, at the time of application, not necessarily, but absolutely at the time, by the time that you would begin your postdoc position. There aren't specific, we don't have data about the optimal number of postdoc programs that you should apply to. You know, I know that at the internship level, APPIC has done an extensive analysis of that. We can say, though, that the average number or the modal number is around 8 applications. But it really varies because some people, you know what they want to do and they apply to one, and some apply to many. So in terms of the timeline, you know, this really varies by program. So it is the case that, you know, most of the programs that have a clinical component in them, the search for programs is starting now. A lot of people are updating their websites. Things are getting posted in the UPPD. So this is the time to start looking. And it's the other piece of that is applications tend to be due, you know, this tends to creep earlier every year, but they tend to be due in early January, but some places now are posting, you know, having them due earlier than that. Interviews do tend to be December, January, February. It is the case that, you know, many places that have internships and postdoc programs don't try to do those concurrently, so the postdoc interviews are a little bit later. This year, in terms of in-person versus virtual, APPIC has released some guidelines and recommendations and is really strongly recommending that programs conduct virtual interviews, and is providing a lot of resources to training programs so that they know how to, so they have some guidelines and tips about how to do that. And I think that is increasingly going to be the case. It's unclear, if anyone really will be expecting applicants to fly around the country, this particular winter. One thing I want to point people to also is there are some terrific timeline documents on the APPIC website. And those are broken down for if you're applying to a clinical program or a neuropsych program or a research program. And they really walk you through, what should you be thinking about in October, November, December, et cetera. So that's a really good resource to consider taking a look at. In terms of applying to research and clinical postdocs, I mean, it's important to know that, that there may be some conflicts. So there is a uniform notification date, and Wayne's going to talk about that more extensively in a minute, but that many clinical programs adhere to, and that is in February. It's the 22nd, so February 22nd, 2021. Postdocs, research postdocs, some of them are aware of that, some of them are not. You may have a research postdoc in a university setting that really is not plugged in at all to the clinical timelines. So it's just important to, be aware of that and be as transparent as you can in terms of what your timeline is, so that you can be clear if you end up getting an offer earlier or later. In terms of applying to jobs and postdocs, the same is kind of true. The jobs are, along a different timeline. They are not necessarily considering the postdoc timeline at all. On the other hand, if you are applying to postdocs and you also are applying to jobs, I think being transparent about that happens. It's not at all uncommon. And just being transparent as you can when you get into the situation of having some preferred places, to let them know what the timelines are and the competing information, the competing timelines are between those two kinds of positions. We often get this question about whether or not you can apply to more than one track or specialty at the same site. So, and I think that the answer is a tentative, yes, you can do that, and it does not necessarily hurt you to apply. I think there has to be a coherent story about why each of those tracks or emphases or specialties would fit for you. So a great example is somebody who's done, a lot of neuropsychology, but also rehab. There may be different specialties that they're applying to, and they could easily, gain a lot of great training in either of those specialties. But it does look pretty diffuse if you're applying across the board to child and adult programs and research and clinical. So you really have to be able to have your CV support your application and have it make a coherent story about what you want to get next as well. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Okay. So in terms of people who are applying for positions in different settings, this also comes up a lot. For example, they are interested in going to VA, they haven't had a VA experience. Again, I think that the issue really is whether or not you are able to frame what your experiences are and show that this is going to be, the next important step for you in terms of your training sequence. So if you're interested in the VA, but you haven't had the opportunity to do that, but you've had a longstanding interest in trauma, or you've had a longstanding interest in men's health, or other things that are are allied with the patient population seen at the VA, that's how you make the case. So obviously it can be to your advantage if you know the VA culture, or the same is true for an academic medical center or university counseling center. Just really to be able to illustrate how your background, I think, is a good fit as well. And last on this slide, so postdoc programs tend to request, they differ, and usually everything is available on their website. Most require a CV, transcripts, a letter of interest, which is going to demonstrate sort of your fit, and some letters of recommendation. Occasionally, they'll require work samples, And sometimes training directors have been asking for a copy of the APPIC, but it's just important to check the website and see what their materials are. Another useful resource here is on the APPIC website is a downloadable spreadsheet of information about different places that you're considering or you're applying to, including what's required and other elements of the programs. So in terms of what should go in your cover letter, it's a little bit different than internship. You really are trying to strike a balance between describing, what you want to learn and how this is the next step for you in your sequence of training, but also what you bring to the site. So this is kind of a hybrid, of moving into a more professional position. So talking about, your fit, your interests, as well as how this is going to help you with your training. It's not unusual for someone with a lot of research experience to apply to clinical postdocs, and how you represent that on your CV. I think again, it's about having a coherent picture of what it is you've done and what it is you want to do and why this step makes sense for you. So you might choose to drop very detailed explanations of your research experiences, but you're not going to take out those experiences. And some people who are applying to different kinds of postdocs will craft different CVs for those types of positions as well. So there is not a standardized reference letter for postdoc like there was for internship. And, a lot of people worry about this. They feel like it's a burden to ask people to write different kinds of letters for different places. And I'm just going to tell you that we all expect to do that. And it's not a big deal to ask for that. But programs often require different kinds of letters too. So this means sort of putting together some information for your letter writers about exactly what it is they need to put in each of the letters. Sometimes there are things like, a verification letter from your internship training director, about your progress on internship as well. So in terms of other letters of recommendation, some people also suggest, having a letter from your internship, an internship supervisor, someone who can speak to your experiences on internship, as well as a letter from graduate school too. Okay. In terms of APPIC, this question is, there is a centralized postdoc application, and not all programs use it though. So this is another place where your spreadsheet could come in handy. So, if you are, there are places that do use that, many places are using it. And so that makes it a little bit easier for you because there's some similar things to the APPIC, so it will be familiar, but not all places will use that. So that's an important thing to kind of keep track of as well. In terms of the APPIC costs, there is a cost of $30 for the first application and $15 for each application after that. So, and lastly, I talked a little bit about virtual versus in-person interviews, and I do think again that this year we're likely to see very largely virtual interviews, and it is the case that there may be places locally that are doing things in person. However, I think that there's recognition that that disadvantages some people who might not be able to travel to the site. So many places are choosing to do entirely virtual, but you should be able to find that information on the website also. Okay, Wayne, this is you.
So to follow up on Beth's last point, the UPPD has a new field this year, which indicates the program's preference for virtual interviews, and the choices are exclusive, where they're only doing virtual interviews, where it's preferred, where they're available, and when they're not offering them. And the majority, I believe, are offering, well, I know the majority are offering exclusive virtual interviews, but there are some that are still requiring in-person interviews for some people. And so it's good to check. My guess is this will be fluid and programs will be maybe moving and changing in that direction as the word gets out to the majority of programs, but that's just something to be aware of. So postdoc selection guidelines. How do you know if a program is following the postdoc selection guidelines? They should indicate that in their public materials. That would be indicated in their UPPD listing. We added a banner this year to the UPPD listings after you do your search. Programs that are following the guidelines or programs that are exempt from the guidelines. Programs that are exempt from the guidelines would be clinical neuropsychology programs and predominantly research programs. So we're trying to reinforce those programs that are following the guidelines if you don't see that banner. And it would be clear in the listing also that the program is not following the guidelines, and then they would have a different notification date, and you would need to kind of find out relevant information. It does not mean this is a bad program. You just need to kind of find out what their process is going to be and how that's going to impact kind of your selection process. Beth mentioned the spreadsheet that you could download from the APPIC site before. This is a really good way to track this information about programs in terms of who's doing what and whether you potentially have any conflicts in dates and timelines. Those timeline documents are great for that as well also. So what do you do if a program doesn't know about the selection guidelines or says they're not following them? If they don't know about them, you could make them aware that it's on the website. They could read more about that. You could refer them to me. My contact information is all over the Postdoc, APPIC Postdoc website, and I would be happy to talk to the program about that. Again, if they're not following the guidelines, you kind of want to know when are they going to be, when's their application deadline? When are they going to be making decisions about interviews? When are they going to be making decisions about offers? What do they do if you get an early offer from another program and they've not reached their timeline yet? So those are really important factors to consider. So how do you handle it if some of the programs you apply to are following the guidelines and some are not? That's a tough question. That spreadsheet can be really helpful in kind of figuring out which programs are kind of that you're applying to or interested in when they're doing what. If you are applying to a mixture of programs and say half of your programs are following the guidelines, half are not, you get an offer from a program that is not following the guidelines, you get that an early offer. You can take that reciprocal offer, or you can take that offer that was early and go to a program that's following the guidelines and say, I got an early offer and request a reciprocal offer. There's a lot of information on the APPIC site about the reciprocal offer process and scenarios, when you can do it and when you can't do that. But this is a way to at least assure that if a program thought you were their top applicant, that they could then make you that offer early. So it's a way to kind of work around programs that may not be following the guidelines. I hope that was clear. Again, those documents can be really useful in terms of understanding that process. In terms of being selected for a postdoctoral program, how do they contact you to offer a position? That can be through phone, that can be through email. This is also one of those important pieces of information to track about how are programs going to be doing this, particularly on programs that maybe are following the postdoc selection guidelines. So it's February 22nd this year. So on the 22nd, you want to know, you want to make sure you're available, and you want to, like, if it's email, you need to have access to your email where you can get that and respond pretty quickly, or that you can answer your phone. And so talking with your internship director, or blocking off some time so that you can be available, or taking leave or vacation so that you can be available to field offers. So that's very important. So being aware of how the program's going to contact you. How long can you hold an offer? If you get an offer from, say, your second-ranked program, you want to then contact your first-ranked program. The guidelines are saying that an offer should be extended for 2 hours at a minimum. You could ask to hold that longer if you want to, but that's the minimum that we're suggesting programs do that. If you are applying to a program that is not following the guidelines, this is one of the questions that may be useful to find out the answer to that program. And that may be fluid. They may not be able to tell you in advance how long that would you could hold that offer for. Chances are the program, if they ask you, if they give you an offer, and you ask to hold it, you could ask how long they would be willing to hold that offer for you at the time. The program may or may not be able to say that in advance. So if you don't accept an offer right away, will the postdoc program view you negatively if I wind up at that site? This is a really good question. Can't answer for every program out there, but most really good programs, training directors, they understand this is a challenging process and that you need to go through your selection. And so if you're holding an offer and you end up accepting it, that almost never ends up in any kind of negative impression. We understand that this happens right away. This happens in jobs as well also. And it's just considered to be part of the process. Would say if a program was to hold a grudge, it would not be like a great place. Maybe doesn't bode well for that program to begin with. So when or could you request a reciprocal offer? I talked about this a little bit already. So the uniform notification date is the 22nd of February. If you get an offer from a program before that, and that is not your top ranked program, you can go to your top ranked program, only your top ranked program, let them know you have an offer and ask them for a reciprocal offer. If they give you that offer back and they say, I'm so glad that you called, you are our top ranked program, we can offer you that position, you must accept it. You can't do this just to feel them out. It has to be your top ranked program. You have to be ready to accept that position, to be fair. And you can't hold it at that point either. You have to accept it immediately. So do not make the call unless you're ready to accept that offer. If you request a reciprocal offer and the program cannot or does not offer you the position, what can you do? You can ask the program where you stand in their rank list. They may be willing to say, you're very highly ranked, there's a good chance that we would end up making you an offer. That would be good information for you to know. That would help you decide whether you want to wait or whether you want to accept the offer from the other program. Some programs would also be willing, if you're kind of not in their top of their list, they may be willing to share that information with you as well also. And then that might be useful for you to say it was your number 2 program that made you an early offer. You might want to accept that offer at that point. And so depending on where programs are in the process, they may or may not be willing to give you additional information, but it is very appropriate, very professional to ask that question. They may not be able to answer it, but you can ask it. If you request a reciprocal offer, what kind of proof do you need to show that you have a valid offer? The guidelines this year are asking that you do forward some type of written proof that you have a offer. That could be in the form of an email from the program. So if a program makes you an offer that you're going to hold and you're going to use that for a reciprocal offer, ask for some type of email confirmation. It does not have to be this long formal correspondence. It could just be simply from that particular site that they're making you an offer for a postdoctoral program, and that would be considered valid. What do you do if you accept a postdoctoral position? Congratulations are in order when that occurs, but also immediately let all the other programs that you're considering know, because this is not a match. You're going to then free up those programs to say you were number 1 on their list. That program will then be free to be able to make offers to the number 2, 3, or 4 applicant program. So you're doing a great service to the program, and you're doing a great service to your fellow applicants by kind of unclogging the system by letting them know. Email is more than an appropriate way to do that. You don't have to make phone calls to let people know that you have accepted a position. But that's considered very much so professional courtesy. What if you do not secure a position on the 22nd and have not heard from all of your programs? That doesn't mean you're out of the running. Those programs may have positions locked up because they're being held. So you can, it's very appropriate, reach out to those programs. Email, phone call is also fine. You can ask them where they stand. Have they made an offer? We are also asking programs to let applicants know immediately when they have filled positions, so that applicants know where they stand as well too. But if you've not heard, it can be, we really recommend that you reach out, find out where you are. And that can then help you kind of make decisions in terms of your next step. So what if you don't have a position on the 22nd and you, hold on a second. Yeah, these got mixed up a little bit. So if you've heard from all of your programs and you still don't have a position on the 22nd, what do you do? First thing, please do not panic. As I mentioned before, there's a significant imbalance in postdoctoral programs. There will be many programs available after the 22nd that have not filled their positions. The UPPD has a function that can be used starting on the 23rd, where programs can go in and indicate where they have unfilled positions. Applicants can then go in and search by programs that have unfilled positions. So you can then use all the search parameters in the UPPD for positions that are still open. I have to admit that not all programs are fabulous about updating that. It sometimes can take a day or two for them to get that in there. So keep checking for updated for programs that are unfilled, that are still open. And then programs should have information in there as well in terms of how do you apply, what is their process going to be. Chances are that is going to be a fluid process where you can submit your materials and we'll make offers when they're ready to do that. But programs, again, will vary on that. But the UPPD is a place to go. Many, many people obtain strong positions after the 22nd. Our offers binding. They are binding in a professional and ethical sense. So if you accept the postdoctoral position, you've made a professional agreement with that program that you're going to accept it. The same way that program has made a professional agreement with you. It is not a legal binding document like the APPIC match agreement, where there could be some legal recourse. But that's kind of not as relevant because this professional agreement is even stronger. Breaking those agreements is not good for programs, it's not good for applicants. Psychology profession is a very small world. These type of things tend to travel with people because everybody knows everybody to some degree. If there is some reason that you can't fulfill an agreement, you need to talk to the program about that. It's also really good to get guidance. But really, you do need to consider these agreements to be binding. You can't accept a postdoctoral program and then take a better offer down the road. That would be considered really inappropriate. Or accept the postdoctoral position and then take a job that you were offered. If you accept the position, you have to be sure that that's a position that you want. And if you're not sure, you shouldn't be accepting it. So I think that is it for our slide section. Any questions? I'll turn it back over to Aaron.
Thanks, Wayne. So we have a cluster of questions having to do with COVID changes related to postdocs. So I think we might.
Yeah.
Did Aaron freeze?
Up.
Yep, he'll come. I think he'll come back. So questions are relating to funding stability, it looks like, relating to COVID, and also I think I saw a question further down in the chat box about whether or not, you know, that, well, two questions. One is whether or not we've noticed a difference in the availability of postdocs overall right now to apply to. And then there was also a question, I think, about funding stability relating to COVID. When you've already accepted and you're in a postdoc, you know, can you feel comfortable that your funding will be for the duration of the time that you've, you know, that's been committed to you? So I don't know, Wayne, maybe you can speak to just being, you know, overseeing the UPPD. Maybe you can speak to the volume issue and whether or not you've noticed anything, you know, slightly different in terms of a decrease. I mean, you know, personally, to me, it seems to be there seem to still be very many postdoc options available, but you have access to the data.
We're aware of a handful, or maybe a little more than a handful, of programs that have closed or lost funding over the summer because of COVID. They've notified me, and we've kind of removed those listings. It is possible there's some others that haven't. But we're talking about positions that will be starting. You're applying to positions likely starting in the summer or fall of next year. So programs that are in there should have their funding secured. Of course, that can always change. Those are really good questions to talk to programs as you're applying. I could say that long-standing programs and healthcare settings, government agencies, maybe tend to be more stable through these. Private practices, non-accredited, non-APPIC programs may be a little bit more tenuous, not all of them, but those are things to consider through all of this. And then I'm not sure if the other part of the question had to do with the changes programs have made. In terms of COVID, we have asked programs to update their UPPD listing to include those type of changes. Now, it's really impossible for a program to know what they're going to be doing in the fall of 2021, but we can anticipate that. And so programs have hopefully updated their materials. And again, this is information you should ask programs about if they're not displaying that in their public materials. Those are really good questions.
I mean, the only thing I would add, I think, in relation to the question about funding stability once you're at a postdoc is, at most places, to be able to post a position, you have to have it in the operating budget. And so typically that means that, if a cut is happening, it happens before it's posted and not during the year at which you're there. So, I can't say that that would never or has never happened, but for most institutions, it has to be budgeted for you to be able to post it. So that does mean that for the year, that you're in it, that it should be solid.
Yeah, I think Aaron is having Zoom problems, so I'm going to take another question, and I think it's related to COVID. Someone asked a question about neuropsych assessment and whether programs will be able to do that. To continue to do neuropsychological assessment through COVID. Again, it's really impossible to predict what's going to be next fall, but I think many neuropsych programs are up and running again, and they're figuring out a way to be able to do this. So this is a way that you can talk to the program. What are they doing now? What do they anticipate being able to do? Again, kind of more established, long-standing programs are probably going to be better able to figure this out.
I'm also noticing some questions about recommendation letters. So one of them was about, is it okay to ask, an internship supervisor, even if you're only a few months in? And then there was an additional question about sort of how many from which kinds of sites. And so, I would say that, I think internship supervisors are very familiar with this bind. And so this happens all the time when people have started, particularly for internships with a later start date, and all of a sudden the postdoc application process is creeping up quickly. So, in general, I think it's fine to ask if they're comfortable doing it. Most people will say that they are because they understand the situation that you're in. And then in terms of where your letters should come from, I think it really varies, and it depends on what kind of position you're applying to. So for example, if you're applying to a position that's primarily clinical at a VA, and you may want to consider having a graduate school mentor write a letter, but if you have supervisors from the VA, you may want to make sure that you have ample perspectives on your work there. On the other hand, if you're applying to a research postdoc, that's different. And you are going to want to have some information from an internship supervisor or your training director, as well as having someone else who can speak to your research experience before the internship. So it really kind of varies depending on the place that you're applying to. There isn't sort of a magic proportion, but they have to be able to speak to the qualities that you're trying to promote to get into that postdoc.
Yeah, I think Aaron is back. I'll let him get his bearings. So I'll take the next question. Question about postdocs and higher pay. I would say search the UPPD. You can't search by salary information, but they should have the salary information in there. But then what qualities are you looking for in a program about licensure in California? So questions about postdoctoral supervision and licensure in different states is a really good question. And since all states and jurisdictions have different licensure requirements, there is no simple answer to that. So my guess is the vast majority of programs in a state are going to meet licensure requirements for that state, but I would become familiar with the licensure requirements of the state that you want to end up being in, and then finding out what that postdoctoral program is offering in terms of supervision and whether that meets criteria. As Beth mentioned earlier, this can be somewhat of an issue if there's a lot of research time that's being done. So some states require hours don't count that are in the service of research or that are part of research, and some states do, so you need to be aware of that. A quick resource is ASPPB.org. So it's ASPPB.org, has information that summarizes the different state licensure requirements, so that can be a good place to start. But you really have to do that checking yourself. There's no like magic formula for that. And you need to be aware of what states you want to be in and whether that postdoctoral program will allow you to meet the licensure requirements.
I'm also seeing a question on the timing of offers on February 22nd. And so, you know, I will say that the time that places who are following the UND can call is 10 a.m. Eastern time. And so they're not supposed to call before that time. And people do make the call at that time to their top ranked applicants. After that, you can imagine it can get a little bit messy where people are waiting to hear back from others, and there may be people holding offers and checking on other sites. But a lot of activity happens over the course of the first few hours, but it can extend over the course of the day. And so, you know, one thing that I think is important to think about is whether or not, you know, if you're going to be in that situation, is that a day that your training director will let you have a professional day? Do you need to take a vacation day? Because you really may need to be available to take a call or check your email. You know, you don't want to be tied up with a lot of obligations so that you're not able to respond to those offers in a timely manner, because the sites do not have to wait hours for you to get back to them for them to go on to their next person.
I'm back. Apologies, my internet connection was unstable. Unfortunately, I just lost the list of chat questions when I got kicked off. So I don't know if Wayne or Beth, you might be able to send them back to me in a message, or just proceed reading the questions in your own chat.
The webinar is being recorded. So that'll be posted the same site where we listed all the webinars. There'll be the recordings next to those listings.
So there is a request to put the ASPPB resource in the chat. So I think that we can make sure that we get that,
Yes.
get that posted as well. So I'm going to talk briefly about, there's a question about neuropsych, what are the negatives of taking a neuropsych job offer versus a postdoc, which meets the Houston guidelines in terms of board certification. So, I mean, first of all, a disclaimer, not being a neuropsychologist, however, so I definitely would suggest, and I'm sure this person, Monica, is, you know, talking to the folks that you need to talk to. But I think that you know, I think the important thing is to look at whether or not the job offer that you have enables you to get some supervised training and research experience that are consistent with the Houston guidelines, and take a close look at the board certification requirements. It is the case that not every single neuropsych postdoc. It is increasingly the case that they are accredited and they are consistent with the Houston guidelines, but there's still a lot of experiences out there that people are doing that enable them to get board certified. But it just means looking and making sure that you have sort of the balance of clinically supervised assessment activities and also some research, I think, that puts you in the same ballpark to be able to get that done. But it takes a little bit of homework, I think, to get there.
Beth, could you take the next one?
The next one is, what's the question? Oh, sorry.
I'm just catching up on where we're at.
Okay.
There was a question about starting internship in September. Is it too soon for supervisors to write letters?
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah.
Did it get answered already?
Yeah, we did cover that. We did cover that. So. I can answer. I'm not sure. There's a question from Jessica Brennan, and I'm not sure if you're talking about a postdoc in California or a postdoc in Canada with the CA in your question. But
California.
I'm sorry?
California.
Okay. So what I would do is take a look at the licensure guidelines in California. My recollection is that there is a lot of supervised clinical hours that need to be documented. I'm not sure if the UPPD is going to give you enough of the nuanced information about that. It really might be looking at the website, and if you interview, asking the questions about people who graduate from that program and how easy it is for them to get licensed. So Wayne, you might be able to speak to this, but the UPPD does talk about some basic components of the program, like what's the emphasis, what kinds of experiences are available, is there research available, but it might not get into some of the nuances that are needed for licensure for individual states. So I think you might be better off, sort of triaging, with a broader list from the UPPD and then drilling in by looking at the websites and trying to figure out if they have the experiences that you want with the licensure requirements in hand from California. That's how I would approach it.
The UPPD is meant to provide kind of basic initial information and then to refer you to the program's more detailed information. So it's not intended to be a very comprehensive overview of the program, but for you to make initial decisions about, is this a program you would be interested in, and then how do you get more information about that program?
So it looks like there's a follow-up question about neuropsych postdocs, asking, is there any information about how many neuropsych postdocs to apply to, referencing that you mentioned that the modal number was 8 for postdocs in general earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, I don't know that we have that information. Some of that would depend upon, are you applying to programs in the APPC and match, or independent programs, or a combination of programs. So it really would depend on that. And if you have like geographic restrictions that you're thinking about, it's really important. Get mentorship from a boarded neuropsychologist, one of your supervisors, and some individual guidance around that question. Because you do need to kind of maximize it needs to be enough in both if you're applying to both in order to ensure that you would secure a position.
I would add, that's from Kayla. If you want to email me, it's possible that we have that information in a review of data that we did recently, and I can take a look into that for you to see if we actually have any information about it. It would be about a year or two, maybe 2 years old, but it might give you a sense of that. I don't recall it being very different, but I would be happy to take a look. There's another question that came just to me from Sarah Snyder, who I think meant it to be in the public chat for everybody, about whether or not it's okay to reach out if there isn't a position posted and to see if there are any potential postdoc opportunities or if somebody would be willing to put together a postdoc. And I will say, I think that that's, I do think there are challenges with that. And you certainly, the worst that could happen is somebody could tell you no. But it is the case that there are times when, people can do that, can put together a position, or particularly if there's a stream of research funding that's come in, or if they have an opening that, is more flexible, that could be turned from a staff position into a postdoc position. So I don't think there's any harm in reaching out and asking about that. The odds are not with you, they're against you, but it's not out of the realm of possibility that that could happen. So.
Okay, I see another question just came in from Anna Abu Ros. Are there other times outside of being offered a position by a lower ranked site where you can ask your top site how you rank?
I can take that one. So if you get an offer from a lower ranked program that doesn't allow you to make a reciprocal offer, there's nothing to preclude, there's no rules like with APPIC match about asking where you rank. There's no rules that you can't do that. So theoretically, you could ask a program anytime, like where you fall. I don't know that I would advise people to do that. You need to have a legitimate reason why you would need to know that information. Otherwise, the program may think you're just like fishing or nervous or whatever, and I don't know that it's going to bode well for you in the process. Maybe to put it a better way is, I don't know that it would be the most professional thing to do, but if you have a compelling reason why you need to know, and why you need to know now, then it would be an appropriate, you could ask a program. They may not be able to let you know or give you any information kind of where you stand.
Thanks, Wayne.
There was another question in there about a couples match.
Yes. Right.
I saw earlier, and there is no match. So there is no couples match.
Well, but this is a neuropsych a match and non-match, like a APSIN and non-APSIN. I think that's the question. So it's, can you please discuss couples match for individuals applying to match and non-match sites for neuro? Should you tell them during a couples match, during the application, interview, or post-interview process? If you get an offer and you're waiting to hear back, what are your options? That's the question.
I don't know that there's a solution to that issue.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that transparency is helpful. There aren't guidelines around, like there are for, for internship, around not being able to say what your preferences are. So, if you have a strong interest in a particular site, I think being transparent about that is useful. The only other advice that I would have is, like, you really have to kind of lay out your timelines, the two of you together, and figure out what the contingencies are and what you would do about them. So, so if you hear from place A that's non-match before you hear from place B in the match, what would you do? So that you have discussed it and reviewed it, and you sort of know with each scenario what your what the two of you agree that you would want to do. So, so I think transparency is important, and then really kind of laying out the contingencies of when these offers, how the non-match and match offers might come in, and how you would manage that. That's very tricky. That's a very tough one.
And I see a question has just come in from Esther Tung, referencing what you were saying about getting different letter writers for types of sites for a research program. Would it make sense to get letters from your graduate school mentor and also perhaps your research assistant position mentor, since internship is often more clinical? And then similarly for a clinical research graduate school mentor if they never supervised you on clinical work?
Yes. So yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, I do think it's, if you're applying to a research fellowship and you think the person that you worked for as an RA can talk about you as somebody with, initiative and ambition and independent ideas, then I think that that is a good person to ask for your for a research fellowship position. And then, you know, in terms of the clinical postdoc, I mean, I think that makes sense to ask your primary graduate school research mentor, like, do they feel like they could speak to this, or what would they, you know, do they feel comfortable writing a letter for this kind of a thing? And really, if they don't, it's not going to be seen as a negative if you don't include that person. Like if you're applying to clinical postdocs and you have maybe your director of clinical training from your graduate school, and then you have a number of letters from your internship clinical supervisors, people are not going to be wondering why your research mentor didn't write you a letter. So, I mean, I think generally, like what seems to make sense is the right thing to do, and to make sure there isn't something that looks like a glaring gap, like nothing from internship. You know, that's kind of a gap that makes people wonder, like, why isn't there anything from there? But other than that, I think, you know, there is some flexibility if the letter writers make sense.
Yeah, Beth, I would add to that is many programs will specify who they want letters from, or they may say at least one letter from an internship director or one from someone familiar with your research. And then as you're getting mentorship through this process, for each site, think about the letters. Who could best speak to your training and experience with the things that site is, what their training goals and objectives or focus would be. And so it's a way for you to kind of show that you understand what that site is, and it's not a generic process, or not as generic as with internships. So you can really kind of tailor that information. The same way you may have the same letter writer writing different letters tailored to different sites. And that's why, like with an APPIC, we require a separate letter for each site. It could be the same letter, but there's the option to tailor those letters. So sites will often tell you.
Relatedly, I see a question about asking a practicum or externship supervisor as a letter of recommendation. I think it depends on if you feel like they can speak to you, speak to your skill level still. If they're going to talk about your early clinical skill development, that may not be as relevant. But if you feel like they can talk about, how quickly you learn certain techniques, and if you've maintained some kind of relationship with them and they know how you progressed in terms of your clinical training beyond the externship and practicum, I think that would be fine. But it has to reflect something that shows your readiness for postdoc. So if you feel like a practicum or externship supervisor can do that, I think that would be fine.
So I'm noticing the time, but we did get one more question. So I wonder, Wayne or Beth, if we could go ahead and answer this last question. Sure. And that question is also related to COVID. So do sites acknowledge that assessment experience is limited or impacted due to COVID and no face-to-face testing? And regarding applying to neuropsych sites, would this impact chances of getting a position? And the background information for Monica Bebian, who asked this question, is her internship is not testing face-to-face and may start testing via Zoom, but has not yet done this.
Yeah, I do think that programs understand that there's limited experience. I don't know that it's forgiven completely. They want people that have some experience, but I think all programs are aware that there is limited that will be occurring now. You're applying now. Most programs aren't making decisions until January, February, and so there's time to kind of get experience. And that's something to ask programs as you're applying. It is very appropriate to contact the training director of a program and ask them these questions specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that if you're in that situation, you're going to want your letter writers to comment on the context and what's available to you in the setting that you're in. Like, you're going to want that supervisor to say, here's our situation. However, this person has taken initiative by doing X, Y, and Z, like putting together, what a battery would look like if you would implement it, in this kind of context, or looking into the, cultural elements that could impact, or doing background reading on, like, you want to hear that you want to know what is happening. The person evaluating you wants to know what's been happening at your site and what you've been able to do there, even if it hasn't been the traditional kind of assessment experience.
So I think we are coming right up against our time here. So I believe you mentioned this, Wayne, but maybe just to repeat for everyone one more time, how will this be accessible, the recording be accessible to everyone?
Yes, the APPIC website that has, there's a site, there's a link to a site called webinars, and the recordings will be listed on that within probably 48 hours, most likely tomorrow.
Okay, so this concludes our webinar. Thank you everybody for attending. We wish you the best of luck in the postdoctoral selection process, and we hope that this has been helpful to you. And again, we'll point you also, in addition to the recording, to other resources available to you on the APPIC postdoc website, which is appic.org/postdoc. With that, we will end our meeting. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Good luck, everybody. Good luck.